Marin Ashwood was quiet, overlooked. A gentle shadow in a world of roaring power. But shadows see things others do not. She saw the tremor in the king's hand as he signed a death warrant, the exhaustion etched in the lines around his piercing eyes, the clenching of a jaw that held back a silent scream. When devastating news arrived of his mentor's death, the one man who had shown him a sliver of kindness, Marin found the king in his chambers, a titan of a man standing rigid, breaking apart from the inside out. She did not offer words of comfort or hollow platitudes. She simply walked to him, a small, determined healer, and wrapped her arms around his shaking frame. And the fortress shattered. 2 decades of frozen grief, for his mother, his soldiers, his lost boyhood, thawed in a devastating flood. For 3 hours the Alpha King of all wolves sobbed, his body racked with a pain that could level mountains, and the Omega healer held him, her quiet strength the only anchor in his storm. In the aftermath, raw and remade, he looked at the woman who had given him permission to be human, and claimed her as his mate, his queen, his choice. Marin Ashwood moved through the world with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being invisible. Her steps were soft on the polished stone floors of the royal infirmary, her voice a low murmur as she ground herbs or stitched a wound. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in their pack's rigid hierarchy, and a healer at that, a role respected for its necessity, but rarely afforded any real power. In truth, each rank carried its own biological gifts. Alphas were built for dominance and war, their bodies larger, their wolves massive and fierce, their command voices capable of bending the will of lesser wolves through sheer instinct. Betas were the balanced core, versatile and steady, the soldiers and craftsmen and administrators who kept any pack running. And Omegas, the ones the hierarchy placed at the very bottom, possessed something the others did not. A heightened empathy, a bone-deep sensitivity to the emotions of those around them. A calming presence that could soothe aggression and mend what was broken, not just in body, but in spirit. Their wolves were smaller, but sharper in senses, attuned to pain and distress, the way a hound was attuned to a scent trail. These were not lesser gifts. They were different ones. But generations of Alpha Kings, rulers like Theron's father Vorlag, who measured worth only by the strength of a fist and the sharpness of a fang, had built a hierarchy that valued combat power above all else. In a world that worshipped dominance, the Omega's gifts of empathy and healing were dismissed as softness, and softness was just another word for weakness. It was not nature that placed Omegas at the bottom. It was tradition, enforced by kings who feared the very emotions Omegas were born to understand. Marin's wolf was not absent. It was a quiet, silver-furred presence that lived close to the surface, smaller than the wolves of alphas and betas, but fierce in its own way, its senses sharp as a blade, and its instincts tuned to the invisible currents of emotion that flowed through every room she entered. In a court that prized brilliant fur, flashing eyes, and dominant auras, Marin's wolf was simply a different kind of creature, built for sensing and mending rather than commanding and conquering. She was plain, her brown hair usually tied back in a simple braid, her gray eyes more observant than expressive. In a world of fiery oil paintings, she was a muted watercolor, easily overlooked and deeply underestimated. She was assigned to the palace after the Battle of the Crimson Ridge, a brutal clash that had sent scores of wounded warriors back to the capital. The main pack infirmary was overflowing, and they needed every competent healer. Marin, known for her steady hands and preternatural calm, was summoned from the lower district clinic where she usually worked. The palace was a world away from the simple cots and scarce supplies she was used to. Here, shelves were lined with gleaming jars of rare lunar herbs. The bandages were clean and plentiful, and the air hummed with a power that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. It was the power of one wolf, Alpha King Theron Voss. She saw him for the first time on her 3rd day. He was conducting an inspection of the infirmary, his presence preceding him like a storm front. A hush fell over the normally bustling room. Healers and patients alike straightened, their heads bowed in submission. Marin, who was in the middle of changing the dressing on a young warrior's leg, simply paused, her hands steady on the clean linen. He was larger than she had imagined, a mountain of muscle and authority clad in black leather. His hair was the color of midnight, his face a collection of harsh, handsome lines that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. But it was his eyes that captured her, the color of molten gold. They swept over the room with an intensity that missed nothing. They were the eyes of a king, a predator, a man who carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. His wolf was a palpable force in the room, a low thrum of dominance that demanded respect, that made lesser wolves want to bare their throats. Marin felt the pressure, a heavy blanket settling over her, and her own wolf stirred in response, not with the urge to submit or cower, but with a strange, quiet curiosity. Her wolf lifted its head, so to speak, and simply watched, sensing something beneath the crushing wave of his dominance that no one else in the room seemed to notice. Exhaustion, bone-deep and carefully hidden, and beneath that, a loneliness so vast it took her breath away. As he passed her cot, his gaze flickered down. He noted the intricate, clean stitching on the warrior's wound, the calm efficiency of her movements. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. Most would have flinched, looked away from the sheer force of his presence. Marin simply held his gaze, her expression placid, before returning her attention to her patient. She felt the weight of his stare linger for a moment longer before he moved on. She did not know that Theron had registered her. He had registered the one person in the room who did not immediately bow, whose scent was a clean, grounding mix of chamomile and earth, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the court ladies and the metallic tang of blood and fear. He had registered the stillness in her, a pool of calm in the chaotic energy of his life, and it unnerved him. Life in the palace was a constant performance of strength. Theron had learned the steps to this brutal dance as a child. His father, Alpha King Vorlag, was a cruel, unyielding ruler who saw emotion as a fatal flaw. The night Theron's mother had been killed by rogue wolves, 7-year-old Theron had wept over her lifeless body. Vorlag had dragged him away, his hand cracking across the boy's face. "Kings don't break," he had snarled, the words searing themselves into Theron's soul. "Tears are for the weak. Your grief is a betrayal to this crown." From that day forward, Theron had built a fortress around his heart. He did not cry when his father died, leaving him the throne at the tender age of 19. He did not cry when his best friend fell in battle. He did not cry when he had to make impossible choices that sent good wolves to their deaths for the sake of the pack. Each loss, each sorrow, was another stone added to the wall, another layer of ice around his core. He was the Alpha King. He was iron. He was unbreakable. But the cracks were beginning to show, visible only to the most discerning eye. Marin saw them. Not just with her healer's observation, but with her omega senses, the part of her biology the hierarchy told her was worthless. She felt them, faint tremors of suppressed anguish that leaked through his iron control like heat through cracks in a furnace wall. She saw them in the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the arm of his throne during a tense council meeting. She saw them in the faint tremor that ran through his hand as he lifted a goblet of wine to his lips, a tremor no one else seemed to notice. She saw the deep, bruising exhaustion that his powerful aura couldn't quite conceal. She watched him from a distance, a silent observer, and a strange, protective ache bloomed in her chest. It was not the fawning adoration the court ladies displayed, nor the fearful respect of his soldiers. It was a simple, profound empathy for the man suffocating beneath the crown. She saw a soul drowning in silence, and she didn't know why, but she felt an inexplicable urge to offer it a breath of air. A few weeks after her arrival, an incident brought them face to face. A trade negotiation with the neighboring Stone Creek pack had gone sour. Their alpha was arrogant and demanding, pushing for territory Theron would never cede. The meeting had ended with Theron's voice dropping to a low growl, his alpha command radiating with such force that the Stone Creek delegation had scrambled from the room in terror. After they were gone, the council dismissed, Theron had remained alone in the throne room. The sheer force of his contained rage had finally found an outlet. His fist had slammed into a stone pillar, the crack of bone echoing in the cavernous space. He hadn't flinched, hadn't made a sound. He simply stared at his bloodied, broken knuckles, the pain a welcome distraction from the fury churning in his gut. His personal physician, an old beta named Elric, had tried to attend to the wound, but Theron had dismissed him with a snarl. "Leave it," he had commanded, and no one dared to disobey the king. No one except the head healer, a shrewd old she-wolf, who knew that an untreated injury on the king's hand was a symbol of unchecked rage that could fester into something far worse. She also knew the king was in no mood to be handled by a submissive beta he could easily intimidate. She needed someone whose presence was so unassuming it would fly under the radar of his anger. She sent for Merrin. Merrin arrived at the king's private chambers with a small wooden box of supplies. 2 royal guards stood sentry, their expressions grim. They barred her way, their spears crossed. "The king is not to be disturbed," one of them growled, his eyes flashing a warning. Merrin did not argue or protest. She simply looked at him, her gray eyes calm and clear. "Head healer Lyra sent me," she said softly. "His hand needs to be set. If it heals wrong, it will affect his grip. It will be a weakness." She used the one word she knew might penetrate his anger. Weakness. The guards exchanged an uncertain look. They had heard the impact, had felt the tremor of the king's rage. They knew the injury was severe. With a reluctant nod, one of them pushed the heavy oak door open, just enough for her to slip inside. The room was dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Theron stood by a massive window, his back to her, staring out at the Capitol. The air was thick with his scent, ozone, pine, and a raw, metallic anger. The pressure of his presence was immense, a physical weight that made her want to retreat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. But her wolf, far from cowering, pressed forward within her. Its empathic senses reading the room like a map. Beneath the anger, it found what it always found in this man. Pain. Old and deep and desperately hidden. This was the Alpha King. To approach him now was to approach a wounded lion. She took a slow, steadying breath, reminding herself of her purpose. She was a healer. This was a patient. She set her box down on a nearby table, the soft click of wood on wood unnaturally loud in the silence. Theron didn't turn. "I said I was not to be disturbed," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. It was laced with the power of his alpha command, a force that should have sent her to her knees. It washed over her, a wave of pure dominance. She felt the instinct to obey, to turn and flee, but her healer's training, the ingrained need to mend what was broken, was a stronger tide. Her wolf held steady within her, its calming presence anchoring her against the storm of his will. "An improperly healed hand is a liability in a fight, Your Majesty," she said, her voice even and quiet, betraying none of the fear she felt. "Your enemies would see it as a sign of weakness." He finally turned, his golden eyes blazing. He loomed over her, his sheer size and power meant to intimidate, to crush her will. "Are you questioning my strength, Omega?" he snarled, the word Omega a deliberate insult, a reminder of her lowly station. Merrin did not shrink back. She met his fiery gaze with her calm, steady one. "No, Your Majesty," she replied. "I am trying to preserve it." For a long moment, they stood locked in a silent battle of wills. His, a raging inferno of power and pride. Hers, a quiet, unyielding stone. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a sincere, infuriating concern. His wolf, which had been pacing and snarling within him, grew quiet, intrigued by this strange, placid creature who did not cower. With a frustrated sigh that sounded more like a growl, he thrust his injured hand toward her. "Fine," he bit out. "Do it. Quickly." Merrin's touch was light and sure. She gently cleaned the blood from his knuckles, her fingers moving with a practiced grace that belied the tension in the room. His hand was huge, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of combat, yet she held it as if it were the most delicate thing in the world. Theron watched her, his expression a mask of stone, but inside, a storm of confusion raged. He was accustomed to being touched with fear, with ambition, with desire. He was not accustomed to this. Her touch was professional yet gentle, impersonal yet profoundly soothing. The clean, earthy scent of her seemed to push back against the choking anger that had filled the room, creating a small pocket of peace around them. As she carefully examined the broken bones, her brow furrowed in concentration, he felt an unfamiliar sensation. The tight coil of rage in his chest began to loosen. He didn't understand it, but her presence was doing something to him, something no command or counsel had ever achieved. His wolf, usually a restless beast, was settling, calming, as if her very proximity was a balm. He didn't know that this was her omega gift at work, the calming influence that her kind carried in their blood, the ability to soothe aggression not through submission, but through a quiet, steady resonance that spoke directly to the wolf within. "This will hurt," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't wait for his permission. With a quick, precise movement, she set the bones. A sharp gasp of pain escaped him, a sound he hadn't allowed himself to make in years. His muscles tensed, his wolf roaring to the surface at the sudden agony, but her other hand came to rest on his forearm, a small, steadying weight. "Breathe," she said softly, and to his utter astonishment, he did. He drew in a ragged breath, the scent of her, chamomile and clean earth, filling his lungs. The pain receded to a dull throb. She worked quickly then, applying a poultice of comfrey and willow bark to reduce the swelling, before wrapping his hand in clean linen bandages. As she wound the linen, her fingertips brushed the raw edge of his knuckles, and for just a moment, something strange happened. A faint, silvery warmth seemed to trail in the wake of her touch, so subtle it could have been a trick of the dim light. Theron blinked, and it was gone. Maren herself didn't seem to notice, her focus entirely on the bandage. But beneath her fingers, the throbbing eased faster than any poultice should have allowed. Her work was meticulous, her focus absolute. When she was finished, she stepped back, her gaze dropping to the floor in a belated show of deference. "It will heal within a week, Your Majesty," she said, "but you should not use it for any strenuous activity." Theron flexed his bandaged fingers. The throbbing was already easing, replaced by a strange warmth from the poultice. He looked from his hand to the small omega standing before him. She had defied him, touched him, caused him pain, and then soothed it, all without a single tremor of fear. "What is your name?" he asked, the question surprising him as much as it did her. She looked up, her gray eyes wide with surprise. "Maren, Your Majesty, Maren Ashwood." "Maren," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He should dismiss her. He should punish her for her audacity. But he found he couldn't. Something about her quiet strength had pierced his armor in a way no weapon ever could. "You are a skilled healer," he said, the words feeling stiff and inadequate. It was the closest to a compliment he had given anyone in years. Maren simply inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Majesty." She gathered her things, her movements once again silent and efficient. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Anger is a loud beast, Your Majesty," she said, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "Sometimes it is the quiet wounds that fester the longest." And then she was gone, leaving him alone in the sudden deafening silence of the room, the scent of chamomile lingering in the air like a ghost of peace. He stared at the closed door, a strange feeling unfurling in his chest. It was not anger. It was not annoyance. It was a disquieting sense of having been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. That single encounter shifted something in the fabric of the palace. Theron found his thoughts drifting to the quiet Omega healer. He started making more frequent, unscheduled visits to the infirmary, under the guise of checking on his recovering soldiers. But his eyes would always find her, a small figure moving with serene purpose among the cots. He watched her soothe a young warrior panicking from a nightmare, her hand resting on the soldier's chest, her wolf's calming influence radiating outward until the young man's breathing steadied and his clenched fists relaxed. He saw her share her own meager lunch with an elderly pack member who had no family to bring him food. She never sought attention, never tried to catch his eye. She simply existed in her own sphere of quiet competence and compassion. Her presence began to feel less like an anomaly and more like a necessity, a quiet counterpoint to the harsh demands of his kingship. He started to look for her scent in the crowded halls, a clean, grounding aroma that cut through the noise. This new awareness did not go unnoticed. The court was a viper's nest of ambition and jealousy, and its most venomous serpent was Lady Isolde. The daughter of a high-ranking council member, Isolde was a stunning she-wolf with hair the color of spun gold and eyes like chips of ice. She was an alpha, powerful and beautiful, and she had made it no secret that she intended to be Theron's queen. She saw the king's subtle shift in attention, the way his gaze would linger on the plain Omega healer, and her pride curdled into a vicious resentment. How could the king, a wolf of immense power and stature, even look at such a creature? An Omega, the lowest of the low, a healer who spent her days elbow-deep in blood and bandages. To Isolde, Meryn was beneath notice, an insect to be crushed. She decided to make an example of her. The opportunity came during the midsummer feast, a grand ball held in the main hall. Healers were not typically invited, but with so many recovering warriors from the Crimson Ridge battle in attendance, a small contingent from the infirmary was required to be on hand for any emergencies. Meryn stood in a shadowed alcove, her simple gray dress a stark contrast to the glittering silks and jewels around her. She felt deeply out of place, a field mouse at a convocation of eagles. She was watching Theron from across the room. He looked every bit the king, regal and imposing, as he spoke with members of his council. But she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he subtly rubbed his now-healed hand. Her wolf sensed the low hum of his restrained discomfort from across the crowded hall. She knew he was not enjoying the festivities. He was enduring them. Suddenly, Isolde was in front of her, a cruel smirk playing on her perfect lips. Two of her sycophantic friends flanked her. "Well, well," Isolde said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Look what crawled out of the infirmary. I didn't realize we were inviting the help to our celebrations now." Meryn's face remained neutral, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. "Head healer Lyra requested our presence, my lady," she said quietly. Isolde laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I'm sure. Tell me, Omega, does the king find your pathetic scent of dirt and weeds a charming novelty? Is that why he's been slumming it in the sick ward so often?" The surrounding nobles snickered. Meryn felt their eyes on her, sharp and judgmental. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. She wanted nothing more than to disappear. "I am here to do my duty, my lady," Meryn said, her voice trembling slightly. "That is all." "Your duty?" Isolde sneered, stepping closer until she was invading Meryn's space. "Your duty is to know your place. You are a rankless nothing, an Omega playing nursemaid. You have no place here. You have no place near the king." With a sudden, vicious movement, Isolde grabbed a goblet of dark red wine from a passing servant and accidentally stumbled, flinging the entire contents over the front of Meryn's simple dress. The red liquid soaked into the pale gray fabric like a spreading bloodstain. Gasps and titters rippled through the crowd. Meryn stood frozen, the cold wine seeping through to her skin, the humiliation a physical blow. Isolde gave a theatrical gasp of mock horror. "Oh, you clumsy thing! Look what you've done! You've ruined my footing and stained your own dress!" Tears pricked at the back of Meryn's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give Isolde the satisfaction. Her wolf bristled inside her, not with aggression, but with a fierce, wounded dignity. She simply stood there, drenched and shamed, as the laughter of the court echoed around her. And then the laughter died. A sudden, chilling silence fell over the hall. The air grew heavy, crackling with an immense, suffocating power. Theron was moving through the crowd, his golden eyes blazing with a fury that was terrifying to behold. The nobles who had been laughing moments before now scrambled to get out of his way, their heads bowed, not daring to meet his gaze. His wolf was on the surface, a primal force of rage and possession that promised violence. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Isolde, his massive frame casting her in shadow. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The low, dangerous growl that rumbled in his chest was more menacing than any shout. "What," he said, each word a block of ice, "did you just do?" Isolde's smug expression faltered. She had not expected this. A public reprimand, perhaps, but not this raw, untamed fury. She paled, the color draining from her face. "Your Majesty," she stammered, attempting a flirtatious smile that looked grotesque in the face of his rage. "It was an accident. The little Omega was in my way." "Do not call her that," Theron snarled. His gaze was so intense, so filled with lethal promise, that Isolde physically recoiled. He then turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal that was more insulting than any verbal tirade. He turned to Marin. She stood trembling, her arms wrapped around herself, the dark stain on her dress a brand of her humiliation. The fury in his eyes softened as he looked at her, replaced by an emotion she couldn't name. It was protective, fierce, and heart-stoppingly gentle. Without a word, he shrugged off his own heavy black velvet cloak, the royal cloak, embroidered with the silver crest of his line, and draped it around her shoulders. The cloak was huge on her, enveloping her small frame. It smelled of him, of pine and ozone and sheer power, and it was blessedly warm. It covered the stain completely, shielding her from the prying eyes of the court. He leaned in close, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Are you all right?" Marin could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She was drowning in the scent of him, in the impossible reality of the Alpha King himself wrapping her in his cloak, defending her in front of the entire court. Her wolf, pressed against the inside of her chest, was trembling, not with fear, but with something she had no name for, a deep, aching pull toward the man standing before her. He straightened, his hand lingering on her shoulder for a moment, a gesture of both possession and reassurance. Then he turned his gaze back to the stunned assembly. "Marin Ashwood is under my personal protection," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Anyone who shows her disrespect shows it to me. There will be no second warnings." He swept his blazing gaze over the crowd, letting the threat sink in, before his eyes landed on the pale, trembling form of Lady Isolde. He did not need to say another word. His message was clear. Humiliating the Omega healer was no longer a sport. It was treason. He then offered Marin his arm, a gesture of honor so profound it sent another shockwave through the room. "Allow me to escort you back to the infirmary," he said softly, his voice devoid of command, a simple, respectful request. Numbly, Marin placed her small hand on his powerful forearm. The entire hall watched in stunned silence as the Alpha King, the unbreakable ruler of all wolves, personally escorted the plain, low-ranking Omega healer from the room, leaving a humiliated Lady Isolde and a chastened court in his wake. As they walked through the silent corridors, away from the prying eyes, Marin could feel the warmth of his body through his sleeve, the steady strength of him a solid anchor in her swirling emotions. He had not just defended her, he had honored her. He had claimed her, in a way, before them all. And in the quiet space of her own heart, her wolf lifted its silver head and howled, a sound only she could hear, a song of recognition that shook her to her core. The king's public defense of Marin became the subject of fevered whispers throughout the palace. Isolde was confined to her family's quarters in disgrace, her ambition thwarted, her pride in tatters. The other courtiers, quick to follow the scent of power, began to treat Marin with a new, wary respect. They still saw her as a low-ranking Omega, but now she was an Omega who held the king's favor, a far more dangerous and unpredictable creature. Marin herself tried to retreat back into the quiet anonymity of her work, but it was impossible. The weight of the king's cloak, which she had folded and stored in her small room, felt like a brand on her soul. Its scent lingered on her skin, a constant reminder of his power and his unexpected gentleness. Theron, for his part, made no further public displays, but the shift was undeniable. He found more reasons to visit the infirmary. He would ask her opinion on new healing techniques, his golden eyes focused intently on her face as she spoke about herbs and poultices. He would bring her rare books on medicine from the royal library, leaving them on her workstation without a word. These small, quiet gestures were more intimate than any grand pronouncement. They were building a bridge between their two disparate worlds, a bridge made of mutual respect and a slowly growing, unspoken affection. One evening, Marin was working late, grinding lunar bloom petals for a sleeping draught. The infirmary was quiet, the only sounds the soft breathing of the sleeping patients and the gentle scrape of her pestle against the mortar. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear him approach. "That smells peaceful," his deep voice said from behind her. Marin jumped, dropping the stone pestle with a clatter. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Theron stood in the doorway, bathed in the soft glow of a single lantern. He was dressed not in his formal leathers, but in a simple tunic and trousers, looking less like a king and more like a man. "Your Majesty," she breathed, quickly bending to retrieve the pestle. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you." "The fault is mine," he said, stepping into the room. "I did not mean to startle you." He walked over to her workstation, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. He looked at the fine, shimmering powder in the mortar. "Lunar bloom, for sleep." "Yes," she confirmed, her hands suddenly feeling clumsy. "It calms the mind. It helps with nightmares." "I am familiar with nightmares," he said, his voice quiet. The simple admission of vulnerability hung in the air between them, more revealing than any royal decree. He looked at her then, his gaze dropping to her hands. "Your hands," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They create peace." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing against hers. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. Her breath caught in her throat. His touch was warm, solid, and it sent a cascade of unfamiliar feelings through her. Her wolf surged within her, pressing against her ribs, a warm, liquid feeling spreading through her chest. It wasn't the aggressive, dominant presence she felt from other alphas. It was something else, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to call to a part of her she didn't know existed, as if her wolf had found the exact frequency it had been listening for its entire life. Theron felt the jolt, too. He felt the faint, answering pulse from her, the quiet but unmistakable presence of her wolf reaching out to his. His own wolf, usually a restless beast of command and control, settled within him, purring with a deep, rumbling contentment he had never experienced. He wanted to pull her closer, to bury his face in her hair and inhale her calming scent, to hold her and let the crushing weight on his shoulders ease for just a moment. But he held back. He had spent a lifetime building walls. He didn't know how to dismantle them. He simply let his fingers linger on hers for a moment longer before slowly pulling his hand away. The loss of contact was a physical ache for both of them. "The soldiers are recovering well," he said, his voice slightly hoarse as he sought refuge in a safer topic. "Your work has made a difference." "I'm glad I can help," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the mortar, unable to meet his intense gaze. An awkward, charged silence stretched between them. He, a king who commanded armies, and she, a healer who mended bones, both found themselves without words. Finally, he gave a stiff nod. "Good night, Marin." "Good night, Your Majesty." He turned and walked away, his broad back disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. Maren sank onto her stool, her legs suddenly weak. She pressed her fingers, the ones he had touched, to her lips. They still tingled with the memory of his warmth. She had spent her life being invisible, and now she had been seen by the one person who mattered most. It was terrifying, and it was wonderful. She did not know that Theron had retreated to the battlements, staring out at the sleeping city, his heart pounding a wild, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He had chosen her. He hadn't understood it until this moment. It wasn't fate. It wasn't destiny. It was a conscious, deliberate choice. In a world of grasping, ambitious alphas, he had chosen the quiet, steadfast Omega. He had chosen peace. He had chosen her. But his world was not a peaceful one, and the fragile bridge they were building was about to be tested by a storm he had not seen coming. The news arrived on a cold, rain-lashed afternoon. A messenger, drenched and exhausted, was brought before the throne, his face pale with dread. He carried a scroll bearing the black seal of the Northern Guard. Theron took it, his expression unreadable as he broke the wax. The message was short, brutal, and utterly devastating. General Cale, the commander of the Northern Guard, had been killed in an ambush. A rockslide, deliberately triggered by mountain rogues, had crushed his patrol. There were no survivors. A wave of nausea washed over Theron. Cale, the man who had trained him after his father's ascent to cruelty. Cale, who had taught him how to wield a sword, how to read a battlefield, how to lead men who would die for him. Cale had been the closest thing to a father Theron had ever known, a gruff, steady presence in the swirling chaos of his life. He was the last remaining link to the boy Theron had been before his heart had been encased in ice. The council members around him began to speak, their voices a meaningless drone in his ears. They spoke of retaliation, of sending legions north, of vengeance. Theron heard none of it. He felt a pressure building in his chest, a terrifying, constricting band of pain. The fortress was beginning to crumble. The stones of grief, laid one by one over 20 years, were groaning under this final, unbearable weight. His mother, his friends, his soldiers, and now Cale. The list was too long, the burden too heavy. He felt the mask of the Alpha King, the one he had worn for 2 decades, begin to crack. He could not breathe. He could not think. He needed to be alone. "Enough," he said, his voice a raw, broken thing. He stood, the scrape of his throne on the stone floor echoing the grating in his soul. Without another word, he turned and strode from the throne room, leaving his stunned council in his wake. He walked through the corridors of his own palace like a stranger, his vision tunneling, the sounds of the world fading away. He didn't see the servants who scurried out of his path, didn't feel the cold stone beneath his boots. He was trapped in the memory of Cale's booming laugh, the kind look in the old wolf's eyes, the feel of his calloused hand on his shoulder. He made it to his private chambers, the same room where Maren had tended his hand, and slammed the door shut. The sound did nothing to silence the screaming in his head. He paced the room like a caged animal, his wolf clawing at the inside of his skin, howling a lament he could not voice. He was suffocating. The grief was a physical entity, a hand squeezing his throat, crushing his lungs. He sank to his knees in the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He stared at the wall, at a tapestry depicting a great victory from his father's reign, but he saw nothing. He saw his mother's pale face. He saw Kael's smile. He felt the sting of his father's hand. He waited for the pain to subside, for the iron control to reassert itself as it always had. But it didn't. This time, the wound was too deep. The fortress walls were breached, and the flood was coming. But 20 years of training held fast in one respect. He could not cry. The tears would not come. There was only the agony, the pressure, the silent, soul-shattering break. He was a king, and kings did not break. But he was breaking. He was shattering into a million pieces, in the suffocating silence of his own making. Maren was in the herb garden when she felt it. It wasn't a sound or a tremor in the earth. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated despair that washed over the entire palace. It was so potent, so overwhelming, that she dropped the basket of lavender she was gathering, the fragrant stems scattering on the damp ground. The feeling was a dark, jagged void that seemed to pull at the very air, a silent scream that resonated deep in her bones. Her wolf snapped to attention within her, every empathic sense she possessed flooding with the raw, unmistakable signature of his anguish. This was what an omega was made for, she realized with a sudden, breathless certainty. Not weakness, not submission, but this. The ability to feel another soul's breaking point. To sense the wound beneath the armor that no alpha's eyes could see and no beta's steady hands could reach. The very gift the hierarchy had taught her to be ashamed of was the one thing that could find him now. It was his pain. Theron. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain. Something terrible had happened. Something had finally broken the unbreakable king. Without a second thought, she ran. She flew through the corridors, her simple dress catching on tapestries, her soft shoes slapping against the stone. Protocol, rank, fear. It all vanished, burned away by an urgent, primal need to get to him. She reached the hallway leading to his chambers. The two guards stood there, their faces ashen, their hands gripping their spears. They had clearly felt it too. They moved to block her, their training warring with the raw terror in the air. "You cannot go in," one of them said, his voice strained. "He will not see anyone." "He needs someone," Maren countered, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't try to push past them. She simply looked at them, her gray eyes filled with a desperate, unwavering certainty. "Please, let me pass." The guard who had let her in before, the one who had seen her calm the king's rage, looked into her eyes. He saw not ambition or foolishness, but a profound, healing empathy. He saw the only person who might be able to walk into that storm and survive. With a grim, almost imperceptible nod, he stepped aside. Maren pushed the heavy door open and slipped inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The room was dark and cold. The air was so thick with anguish it was hard to breathe. And in the center of the room, she saw him. He was on his knees, his back ramrod straight, his head bowed. He wasn't moving. He wasn't making a sound. But she could feel the violent tremors running through his massive frame. He was a mountain in the midst of a catastrophic earthquake, holding itself together through sheer force of will, moments from collapsing into dust. His scent was a maelstrom of grief, a scent so painful it made her own chest ache in sympathy. Her heart broke for him, for the little boy who was taught that tears were a sin, for the man who had carried the world on his shoulders alone for so long. She knew with absolute certainty that words would be useless. Platitudes would be an insult to the depth of his pain. There was only one thing she could do, one thing she had to do. She walked across the room, her steps soft and sure. She knelt on the cold stone floor behind him. She didn't touch him, not yet. She just let her presence be a quiet anchor in his raging sea. Let her wolf's calming influence radiate outward, not to suppress his grief, but to tell him, without words, that it was safe to feel it. And then she wrapped her arms around him. Her small arms barely fit around his broad, shaking shoulders. She pressed her cheek against the hard muscle of his back, holding on as if she could physically hold the pieces of him together. She said nothing. She just held him. For a moment, he remained rigid, a statue of iron and agony. And then, with her touch as the catalyst, the final wall crumbled. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, guttural sob that was the sound of a soul breaking open. His entire body convulsed, and he collapsed forward, his weight falling against her. Maren didn't flinch, didn't stumble. She became his foundation, her small frame bracing his massive one. He turned in her arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck, and the storm broke. 20 years of unshed tears, of frozen grief, of silent, solitary pain came pouring out in a devastating flood. Great, shuddering sobs racked his body, shaking him with a violence that would have terrified anyone else. He cried for his mother, his voice a broken, boyish whisper against her skin. He cried for Kale, roaring his grief into the fabric of her dress. He cried for every soldier he had sent to their death, for every hard choice, for the crushing loneliness of his crown. It was the sound of a drought-stricken land finally receiving rain, a torrent that threatened to wash everything away. Maren just held him. She ran her hand through his dark hair, her fingers tracing soothing patterns on the back of his neck. She murmured soft, meaningless sounds, the way a mother would soothe a weeping child. She absorbed his pain, her own tears falling silently into his hair, not for her own sorrow, but for his. She had never held anyone like this. She had held dying soldiers, had cradled the hands of wolves taking their last breaths, but this was different. This was the most powerful creature she had ever known, stripped of every defense, trusting her with the most vulnerable thing he possessed, his broken heart. The weight of that trust was staggering, and somewhere in the long, dark hours of his grief, she felt the last wall around her own heart fall away. She loved him. Not the king, not the alpha, but the man sobbing in her arms, and she would hold him for as long as the storm raged, for as long as he needed, even if it broke her too. For 3 hours, the Alpha King of all wolves wept in the arms of the Omega healer. The sun set, casting the room in deep shades of purple and gray. The palace held its breath. And in the quiet darkness of the king's chambers, a woman who had always been invisible gave a king permission to be human again. The storm eventually passed. The racking sobs subsided into ragged, shuddering breaths. The torrent of grief slowed to a trickle. He lay against her, utterly spent, his massive weight a comfort rather than a burden. The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of their breathing. He felt empty, but it was not the cold, hollow emptiness of before. It was a clean, quiet emptiness, like a field after a cleansing fire, ready for new growth. He slowly lifted his head from her shoulder. Her dress was soaked with his tears, her hair was a mess, and her face was streaked with her own silent sorrow for him. She looked at him, her gray eyes impossibly soft, filled not with pity, but with a deep, unwavering understanding. She had seen him at his absolute weakest, had witnessed the shattering of his iron facade, and she had not run. She had held him. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly, and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His thumb stroked her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized was there. In that moment, the crown, the titles, the ranks, they all fell away. There was only Theron, a man remade by grief, and Maren, the woman who had guided him through the flood. He looked into her eyes, and the choice he had felt solidifying within him became an undeniable, irrevocable truth. Mine, he whispered, the word a raw, possessive prayer. It was not a command, it was a declaration, a recognition, a promise. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, followed by a soft, dawning acceptance. She didn't speak, but he saw the answer in the way she leaned into his touch, in the way her wolf reached for his, a silver warmth meeting a dark, rumbling power. It wasn't the call of a fated bond preordained by the moon. It was something stronger. It was the deliberate, conscious choosing of two souls who had found in each other the missing part of themselves, not a half, but a complement. He had been a king of iron. She had shown him that true strength was forged in the heart. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound intimacy and respect. I choose you, Maren Ashwood, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Before my grief, before my crown, before all else, I choose you. The days following Kale's death and Theron's shattering were a quiet revolution. A subtle but profound change had occurred in the Alpha King. The iron mask was gone, replaced by a sober strength that was no less powerful but far more human. He still carried the weight of his crown, but he no longer carried it alone. He began to include Maren in his life in small, significant ways. He would summon her to his study, not for healing, but to simply sit in quiet companionship as he worked through piles of missives. Her serene presence, the steady calm of her Omega Wolf, soothed the restless beast of his responsibilities in ways nothing else could. He would walk with her in the royal gardens, listening as she explained the properties of each plant, finding a strange peace in her gentle wisdom. In the days after his grief, Theron also turned his attention northward with a cold, deliberate fury. He dispatched 3 of his most seasoned war packs to the mountain passes where Chaol had fallen, and within a fortnight the rogues who had orchestrated the ambush were routed from their strongholds and brought to justice. It was the last act of the old Theron, decisive and merciless, but when the report of their capture arrived, he did not celebrate. He simply set the scroll aside, his eyes distant, and murmured, "It is done, old friend." For Maren, life had been turned upside down. She was no longer just a healer, she was the king's chosen. The looks she received were now a mixture of awe, envy, and confusion. She still performed her duties in the infirmary, finding solace in the familiar routines, but she knew that her old life was over. Her heart, which she had guarded so carefully, was now irrevocably tied to the king. She loved him, not for his power or his title, but for the broken man she had held in her arms, and the stronger man who was emerging from the wreckage. Their bond was a quiet, private thing, nurtured in stolen moments away from the prying eyes of the court. But they both knew a public declaration was necessary. A king could not choose a mate in secret. General Chaol's funeral was held on a gray, somber morning, the great hall draped in black and silver. Theron stood before his people and honored his mentor with words that were simple and true, the eulogy of a man who had finally learned how to grieve honestly. He spoke of Chaol's bravery, his loyalty, his gruff kindness. He spoke of the debt the kingdom owed to wolves like Chaol, wolves who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. He did not speak of his father. He did not speak of his own breaking. Some wounds were not for the crowd. Maren stood with the other healers, her hand pressed to her heart, and wept quietly for the man her king had loved and lost. Isolde, who had served her period of disgrace and returned to court with her ambition sharpened, watched the proceedings with calculating eyes, looking for an opening that never came. The funeral ended with the howl, the ancient rite of farewell, and every wolf in the hall raised their voice to the sky. In the days that followed, Theron prepared for the declaration. He did not consult his council. He did not seek their approval. This was not a political decision. It was a truth. He summoned the full court to the great hall on a clear, cold evening, the same hall where he had defended Maren from Isolde, the same hall where Chaol had been honored. The nobles came expecting a policy address or a military announcement. They found their king standing alone on the dais, his golden eyes blazing with a quiet, unshakable resolve. Lady Isolde positioned herself near the front, her golden hair gleaming, her posture radiating availability and alpha strength. She still believed. She still hoped. She was about to learn that some battles could not be won with beauty or bloodline. Theron let the silence stretch until the hall was perfectly still. Then he spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of the cavernous room. "I have stood before you many times to speak of war, of treaties, of the burdens of this crown. Tonight I stand before you for a different reason. I stand before you to speak of strength." He let the word hang in the air. "For my entire reign, I have measured strength the way my father measured it, and his father before him. By the dominance of a wolf, by the force of a command, by the willingness to endure without breaking. I built my rule on this definition. and I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Theron's gaze swept over them, unflinching. True strength is not the absence of feeling. It is the courage to feel and still stand. I know this because I was shown it by someone who possesses more of this courage than any warrior I have ever led into battle. He looked to the side of the hall, where Maren stood among the healers, her face pale, her gray eyes wide. She didn't know this was coming. He had not warned her. He couldn't risk her talking herself out of it, convincing herself she wasn't enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't the right choice. She was all of those things, and he would prove it. Maren Ashwood, he said, and his voice softened, the commanding edge giving way to something raw and real. Come here. The hall gasped. Maren's heart stopped. The other healers around her stared. She stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment, her wolf pressing against her ribs, urging her forward. One step, then another. The crowd parted for her as she walked toward the dais, her simple dress and braided hair a stark contrast to the glittering court. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at him with eyes that held 1,000 questions. Theron descended to meet her. He took her hands in his massive, scarred fingers closing around her small, steady ones. He turned them both to face the court, his arm around her waist, solid and sure. This woman, he said, his voice ringing through the hall, is an Omega healer. The hierarchy we have built tells you that this makes her lesser, that her rank places her beneath every alpha, every beta in this room. I am here to tell you that this hierarchy is wrong. A shocked silence fell. Even Isolde's carefully maintained composure cracked. For generations, we have measured worth by what a wolf can destroy. We have placed the warriors at the top and the healers at the bottom, as if mending is less important than breaking. We have dismissed the gifts of Omegas, their empathy, their ability to sense what the rest of us are too proud or too blind to see, and we have called it weakness. He looked down at Maren, his expression fierce with pride. This woman saw what no one else could see. She healed what no one else could reach. And she did it not with dominance, not with power, but with a quiet, unyielding strength that humbles every roar I have ever made. He raised their joined hands. I, Theron Voss, Alpha King of the Silver Moon Pack, choose Maren Ashwood as my mate, my partner, and my queen. Not despite what she is, but because of it. She is my strength. She is my heart. And anyone who challenges her challenges me. The silence that followed was vast and heavy. The council members looked at one another. An Omega as queen? It was unprecedented. It was a revolution. And then, from the ranks of soldiers lining the walls, a voice broke through. It was a captain from the Crimson Ridge battle, a scarred warrior whose shattered leg Maren had saved from amputation. "For Queen Maren!" he roared, slamming his fist against his chest. The cry spread like wildfire through the military contingent. These were men and women who had felt Maren's hands on their wounds, who had watched her work through the night without rest, who knew her strength in the most intimate and grateful way possible. Their voices rose in a thunderous endorsement. The commoners in the gallery joined in, the wolves who knew her from the lower district clinic, the ones she had treated for free, the ones whose children she had healed when no one else would come. The nobles, surrounded by a roaring tide of approval from the people and the military, had no choice but to follow. Isolde watched it all, her face draining of color, her lips pressed into a thin white line. She understood, in that moment, that she had never been competing with Maren at all. She had been competing with a kind of strength she did not possess and could not imitate. She turned and walked from the hall without a word, her golden hair catching the torchlight one last time before the doors closed behind her. In the weeks that followed, her father quietly resigned his seat on the council, and Isolde departed the capital for a distant family estate in the eastern mountains. Maren, standing beside her king as the hall erupted around her, felt her wolf surge within her chest, not with a new power, but with the full, unrestrained expression of the power it had always carried. Her eyes, normally a soft gray, brightened with a luminous silver light, the color of moonlight on still water. It was not the gold of an alpha's dominance. It was something different entirely, the silver of an omega fully realized. A healer whose gifts were no longer hidden or diminished, but blazing for all to see. Theron looked down at her, his golden eyes meeting her silver ones, and the pride in his gaze could have lit the hall brighter than 1,000 torches. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gentle, reverent seal on the vow he had made before his kingdom. The king of iron was gone, replaced by a king of heart, and at his side stood his silver-eyed queen. The aftermath of the declaration was a time of healing, not just for Theron, but for the entire kingdom. The pack, having seen a king willing to be vulnerable, and a queen whose power was rooted in compassion, began to change. The old order, built by kings who believed that only the fist mattered, who had ranked their people not by what they gave, but by what they could destroy, was quietly crumbling. Omegas, so long dismissed as the lowest of the low, began to be seen for what they truly were: the empaths, the healers, the ones who held the pack together not with dominance, but with understanding. Worth was beginning to be measured not just by rank or dominance, but by character and contribution. Maren, with Theron's full support, revolutionized the pack's approach to medicine. She established new healing clinics in every district, training others in her methods, ensuring that every wolf, from the highest alpha to the lowest omega, had access to compassionate care. She was a queen of the people, her gentle strength a perfect complement to Theron's decisive leadership. Their love, now open and celebrated, deepened with each passing day. They found their rhythm not in grand romantic gestures, but in the quiet moments. In the shared silence of his study late at night, her hand resting on his as he read over a treaty. In the warmth of her body curled against his as they slept, a silent promise against the nightmares that still sometimes came for him. One night, under the light of a full, brilliant moon, Theron led her out of the palace and into the royal woods. The air was cool and crisp, scented with pine and damp earth. "There is one more thing we must share," he said, his voice low and reverent. "If we are to be true mates, our wolves must run together." He stepped back and closed his eyes. Maren watched, mesmerized, as the transformation began. It was not the violent, painful process she had seen in younger wolves. For him, it was a fluid, powerful release. His bones elongated, his muscles bunched and reformed, and his skin gave way to a coat of thick, midnight black fur. In moments, the man was gone, and in his place stood a magnificent wolf. He was enormous, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, his fur the color of a moonless night, his eyes the same molten gold as his human form. He was the embodiment of power, of kingship, of the wild spirit of their people. He took a step toward her and nudged her hand with his massive, wet nose, whining softly, encouragingly. Maren smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed her quiet face. She closed her eyes, reaching for the silver thread of her wolf, the companion that had been with her always, steady and true, even when the world told her it was not enough. The shift came easily, as natural as breathing, her body flowing into its other form with a grace that spoke of long practice. Bones shifted, muscles grew, and her senses exploded. The world rushed in, the scent of 1,000 different plants, the sound of a field mouse scurrying 100 yards away, the feel of the cool night air on her fur. She opened her eyes and stood before him, a wolf of silver. She was smaller than Theron, sleek and graceful where he was broad and powerful. Her coat was the color of moonlight on snow, and her eyes were the same luminous silver that had blazed in the great hall. But here, in the wild, her wolf was not small or lesser. It was exactly what it was meant to be, a different kind of strength, a complementary force, the calm to his storm. Theron's wolf let out a soft, rumbling purr of delight. He nudged her, more playfully this time, inviting her to run. And she did. They ran together through the forest, a flash of midnight and a streak of silver under the watchful eye of the moon. They were a perfect contrast, power and grace, darkness and light, moving in perfect harmony. There was no dominance, no submission, only the joyous, unbridled freedom of two souls, two wolves, finally running as one. They howled together at the moon, their voices intertwining, a song of love and belonging that echoed through the kingdom. In that moment, they were not a king and queen, they were just Theron and Maren, two mates, two halves of a whole. Their bond sealed not by fate, but by choice, and now consecrated by the wild magic of the moon. Years passed. The Silver Moon Pack thrived as never before. Under the joint rule of their Alpha King and their Luna Queen, the kingdom became a beacon of strength and compassion. The old, cruel ways of Vorlag's reign faded into memory, replaced by a new era of justice and unity. Theron and Maren ruled as they lived, as partners. His decisive strength was tempered by her gentle wisdom, and her compassionate heart was protected by his unwavering power. They had 2 children, a son with his father's dark hair and his mother's calm gray eyes, and a daughter with silvery hair and her father's fierce golden gaze. The palace, once a place of cold stone and lonely power, was now filled with laughter and warmth. One sunny afternoon, Theron stood on a balcony overlooking the gardens. He watched as his son, 5-year-old Kale, named for the mentor he still missed, tripped while chasing a butterfly and scraped his knee. The little boy's face crumpled, and a loud, heartbreaking wail filled the air. Theron's first instinct, the ghost of his father's training, was a flicker of impatience. Stop crying. Be strong. But it was a faint echo, easily dismissed. He watched as Maren, who was tending her roses nearby, knelt by their son's side. She didn't shush him or tell him it was nothing. She simply gathered him into her arms, her hand stroking his hair. "Oh, my brave little wolf," she murmured. "That looks like it hurts very much. It's all right to cry. Let it all out." Theron smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. The cycle was broken. He walked down into the garden, his footsteps soft on the grass. He knelt beside Maren and their weeping son. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and gently wiped a tear from the boy's cheek with his thumb. Kale looked up at him, his sobs quieting, his big gray eyes filled with unshed tears. Theron pulled his son into his own arms, holding him close against his chest, just as Maren had held him all those years ago. "It's okay, son," Theron said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "It's okay to hurt. Your father is here." He held his child, feeling the small body relax against his, the last of the sobs fading into sniffles. He looked over his son's head and met Maren's gaze. Her silver eyes were shining with love and pride. In her eyes, he saw his reflection. Not an unbreakable king of iron, but a husband, a father, a man made whole. He had learned the hardest and most important lesson of his life, not on a battlefield or in a throne room, but in the arms of a quiet healer who had taught him that true strength isn't the absence of weakness, but the courage to embrace it. And that love, a deliberate choice made every single day, was the most powerful kingdom of all.